Ukraine is fighting that war for us. That's why I'm here.
Based on this, Ukraine is a direct candidate for America's support.
Right now, the United States is not a reliable partner.
The security structure of the world is broken.
There's never been anything like that since World War II.
We have no right to lose.
I've been interviewed on CNN. So what I was doing in those days was trying to help clear the unexploded munitions at Stomel Airport.
So what's the problem?
It's going to take, 100 years to do that.
Something is fundamentally wrong with the world.
My father was a Methodist preacher. I'm a cold warrior.
You and your wife are both military.
She understands about being separated. Support Ukraine.
Today, we are having a difficult conversation in the context of an extremely difficult situation on the geopolitical and military fronts on the 2nd anniversary of the Great War and the 10th anniversary of Russia's open aggression against Ukraine. We are not looking for the guilty. We appreciate and are grateful to the United States for its leadership in uniting the world to help Ukraine. However, it is evident when in the center of Europe in the 21st century, events occurring within our country suggest something is fundamentally wrong with the world today. And every day, the delay in providing aid equals a new military cemetery where ordinary civilians are buried. They are men and women who did not choose the military profession, but they became one to protect their country. John, a pressing question for you. Why the collective action is still not ready to give us enough help to win? What is it really about? Ignorance, inability, or, as they say in our country, a lack of political will?
There's a real struggle in the United States right now between most people who want to support Ukraine and a small group of people on the right who are blocking that aid. I think it will eventually come. I'm hopeful it will come soon, but I think that's the biggest issue politically.
What is the West not ready for? Ukraine's victory or Russia's defeat?
I think what they're most concerned about probably is Russia's defeat because of the fear that Russia will use nuclear weapons. That's the big thing that frightens a lot of people around the world, is the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons, and if they were brought down to a complete destructive defeat, that they might use them in anger.
John, let's get back to our main question that is so painful for all Ukrainians. Why is American aid to Ukraine taking so long? While our needs from air defense to F-16 aircraft are eventually met, the delay comes at such a high price. I'm sure the whole world remembers our cry at the beginning of the war, "Close the sky over Ukraine." Looking at the U.S. foreign policy, everything seems extremely simple. There are two directions. One of them sounds like this. I quote, "This is to ensure a more secure, democratic, and prosperous world. Therefore, the role of the USA is to help countries on their way to democracy. And the second direction is to fight against terrorism. Based on this, Ukraine is a direct candidate for America's support, and at the same time, Russia is a direct candidate for its restraining." We won't delve into the history of a century ago, but let's recall the events that took place fairly recently, in 2013 and 2014. The Revolution of Dignity at Independence Square lasted 92 days continuously. This is an unprecedented demonstration of Ukraine's pro-European position, which has been proved to the whole world, reinforcing it with the blood of the Heavenly Hundred. So, what's the problem? Perhaps the fair answer was given in the interview of American General Clark, which he gave on the eve of the 2nd anniversary of the Great War in Ukraine. And this is what he said. America made a critical mistake in perceiving Ukraine, not recognizing its subjectivity, which is further converted into territorial integrity, readiness to discuss membership in NATO, etc. Of course, it is impossible to consider Ukraine's victory without Russia's defeat. Therefore, the following open question regarding Russia: what facts are still missing to recognize Russia as a terrorist country or a state sponsor of terrorism? 2014, the annexation of Crimea, the occupation of Luhansk and part of Donetsk regions, the dawning of the Malaysian Boeing 777, and the death of almost 300 civilians. Then, Putin's statement about denazification, demilitarization, direct threats to Ukraine regarding process of decommunization, and threats to the world in case of their support for Ukraine in February of 2022. And after that, 2 years of terrible events like the one that America experienced on September 11th of 2001. After this terrorist attack, American troops were already in Afghanistan for a month to remove Taliban from power and destroy the Al-Qaeda group. And what about Russia? Incidentally, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly recognized Russia as a terrorist state in 2022. The United States still hasn't done that. This is how we see the situation from our side. And I ask you, John, to share your perspective. In your opinion, who sets the red lines between America and Russia, and what happens behind the scenes? And what is actually holding the U.S. back from helping us win?
That's a fairly difficult question to answer. We just extracted ourselves from Afghanistan, and we're still engaged in Iraq and Syria. And I think there was at that point a lot of weariness about sending our boys overseas to fight. So I think there was reluctance on the beginning to getting into a wider war. I don't agree with that personally. Obviously, I don't agree with that because I think what Ukraine is doing is fighting our war for us. And when I say our, I don't mean the United States specifically, but I mean the Western world, the world that is trying to establish a rules-based order. I think Ukraine is fighting that war for us. That's why I'm here. I think you asked about behind the scenes, what's causing the problems behind the scenes, and that's also a complicated answer. But I think it's a combination of things. It's a combination of the fact that there is an awful lot of Russian propaganda that is being effectively used against some of the leadership of the United States. I think the Russians definitely have managed to infiltrate their fingers into some of our political parties. We've seen examples of that, like Paul Manafort, that was an advisor to the Trump campaign, had recently worked on behalf of Russian-backed parties in Ukraine. So I think there's a sense in which Russian money and Russian propaganda have seeped into particularly the Republican Party and have resulted in some conspiracy theories and crazy ideas and reluctance to get involved internationally. The other problem, of course, is that there is a right-wing group in the Republican Party that's loyal to the former President Trump, and they are willing to do pretty much anything they can to make the current administration look bad. So when there was a bill that had been worked out between the two parties with all the border things that the Republicans wanted, plus funding for Ukraine, plus funding for Israel, Trump waved his hand, and the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, decided not to even bring the bill up for a vote. It probably would have passed if he'd brought it up for a vote.
And the question that worries us right now is whether the U.S. will unblock aid to Ukraine before the next presidential election. So how do you think the events will unfold if the U.S. does not solve this issue positively and actually removes its leadership role in this situation?
Well, it is my hope, and I've seen signs of this, that Europe is starting to step up a little more. I'm not happy about what's happening in the United States. I think that comes out pretty clearly. But the good sign is that the European community and the United States current administration are looking for ways to get around this current blockade or this current lack of funding. And I think some of those will eventually be successful. The sooner the better. But I think it's important. I mean, I'm not happy about this development, but I think it is, the one good thing you could say about it is that Europe has kind of been put on notice that they may have to take more of an active part in defending Europe than maybe they had been doing before. So I think that's very important for Europe to get that message. I still want to see the U.S. Heavily involved. I still want to see the U.S. supporting Europe and Ukraine. But I think it's a good sign that that Europe itself is becoming more involved and more activated by this threat.
For me, freedom is?
Freedom is the freedom to speak your mind and to have control over what you do with yourself and your life.
I'm being guided by
a need to try to do what's right in a world where there are lots of things going wrong.
The most important quality to work in a team and who you would never work in a team with.
Well, I think the most important quality for teamwork is that the leader needs to look at the abilities of everybody on the team and value their contributions. So somebody I would never work with is somebody that thinks they know everything and can do everything themselves.
Family or work?
Well, you can't really choose just one over the other, or you shouldn't. You have to work because you have to feed your family. But at the same time, family is forever. Work is only for a few years.
The highest award for me is?
The highest reward for me is just a thank you from people that I'm working with.
My main message to the world today.
Support Ukraine.
Let's go back to history 70 years ago. As an American military, how did you perceive the socialist bloc of countries and the Soviet Union in general after the Second World War? And how did the USA and the Soviet Union go from being victorious allies to a state of Cold War?
Well, I think, I obviously wasn't alive when the end of World War II occurred, but from what I understand in my readings and so forth, that there were a lot of U.S., particularly military officials, that were suspicious of the Soviet Union from the start. And of course, the Soviet Union invaded Poland and attempted to basically split Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union in the beginning. And then, of course, Germany turned on the Soviet Union. So I think there was a good bit of suspicion among a lot of senior military leaders from the very beginning. In fact, there's the famous scene where General Patton was ready to attack the Soviet Union immediately after the end of World War II. Political leaders, of course, were not anxious to get into another war after this huge World War II, so that didn't go anywhere. But it wasn't very long where I think the Soviet Union showed kind of its true colors by dividing up Germany into two, dividing Berlin into two, building the wall, and all of these sort of things that became a part of my early life and my military experience. I'm a Cold Warrior, so I came into the Army in the 70s and was present when the Berlin Wall was still a thing. And when it still existed, I was in the Army when the Berlin Wall fell. I was in Berlin for the very last East German military parade. My wife was stationed in Germany when the wall came down. So we, both of us, experienced that period of time when the Soviet Union began to come apart and when it collapsed. And there was a brief period in there, I know I felt it, that we said, well, now we can be friends. Russia's decided to separate. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and all these different countries are yearning for freedom and yearning for growth. And perhaps Russia will be the same way, and we can be friends with Russia and we can engage with them. And so there was a honeymoon period there for a few years where we honestly thought, or at least I think I did, and some of our politicians certainly did, honestly thought that maybe Russia could be a partner and not an enemy. Very quickly, though, we began to see examples of where that was not going to be true. And whereas most of the former Soviet states that were, Lithuania, the Baltic states, the Ukraine, and so forth, began to move towards the West and move towards Europe, Russia began to retrench and began to send out its fingers to try to make controls, the hybrid warfare, the computer warfare and so forth against these countries. So we began to see where Russia was growing more of a threat. And writers 10 and 15 years ago that I read were talking about Putin is going to try to bring the Soviet Union back again. Obviously they were right.
Was America involved in the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I don't actually really know the answer to that question. I think probably there was pressure, and of course there was support to the people who, for example, were demonstrating in Berlin, in East Berlin, against the wall when Gorbachev spoke in Berlin in 1989. And so I think there was definitely political support. Whether or not there was other support, I'm not really able to say. Clearly, it was something that we wanted to see was the Soviet Union cease to exist because it was our principal adversary in the world.
Why today the collective West is afraid of the collapse of Russia, like the collapse of the Soviet Union 33 years ago?
There is some concern that if Russia collapses as a nation and separates into its internal republics, that there will be a problem with refugees, there will be a problem with taking care of all the people, and of course one of the big problems is the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons. And so the nuclear weapons are scattered in the various republics as they were in Ukraine before the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I think there's some concern that there will be a lot of movement of people across Europe, like I said, refugee flows, and also the loss of control of these nuclear weapons, which some of these republics might conceivably sell to terrorist actors or something like that in exchange for food or money. So that's my understanding of what the international concern with basically the complete defeat and failure of Russia as a state.
Do you think that the existence of an independent Ukraine is like a bone in Putin's throat that prevents him from breathing? Do you think that for Putin, among all of the former Soviet republics, the destruction of Ukraine is the most important? And if so, why is that?
As the question kind of points out, Ukraine was the largest and probably richest in terms of natural resources part of the Soviet Union that was given up in 1991. So I think part of it is that Ukraine also is beginning to demonstrate and has been beginning to demonstrate how it is rapidly moving towards the West, moving towards Europe. I think the Maidan demonstrations and the revolution that occurred then were that was in some ways the critical point for Putin when he realized that he could no longer control Ukraine like he controls Belarus, by putting a puppet in place. So he was very angry about that, and he saw that basically Ukraine was slipping away from his grasp. And as I said, Ukraine is not only rich in resources, which it is, but it's also a large country moving away from the old Soviet orbit, from the Russian orbit, into the European orbit. And I think that just was too painful for him to endure. Putin is afraid that if Ukraine is successful, that other parts of Russia will follow their path.
Studying our own history, we see one fact. Russia stole and appropriated the history of Ukraine as its own, and that is exactly why the existence of Ukraine threatens the existence of Russia.
I do have a comment about that, though. You can talk a lot about history, and if you go far enough back, as You know, after Putin had the interview with Tucker Carlson where he talked about history for 30 minutes, his invented history, you know, the president of Mongolia said, you know, actually it was all a part of our empire before that, so let's go back to that time and we'll take everything. The point is that history can be twisted to say a lot of different things, and a lot of different kinds of population flows have occurred, particularly across Europe and Asia in all these times. History started in 1991. So history started when Ukraine became an independent nation after being subjugated by the Soviet Union for all those years. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, where the Kievan Rus were, you know, 2 centuries ago, that doesn't amount to a hill of beans. History started in 1991. Ukraine is an independent country. We guaranteed the security of Ukraine in 1994 when we asked Ukraine to give up nuclear weapons back to Russia. So, you know, all of that history stuff can be used as arguments, but it's not an effective argument against 1991.
As you have already said, and everybody knows that after leaving the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the 3rd country in the world in terms of nuclear potential, and it transferred nuclear weapons to Russia under US pressure. Ukraine also joined the disarmament movement in the 90s and transferred or destroyed its missile potential. In return, Ukraine received guarantees of security and territorial integrity, the so-called Budapest Memorandum, which by the way, was also signed by America. In 2014, it was actually violated by Russia without any consequences for it. Can we say that the security structure of the world is broken?
Oh yes, I would absolutely agree. As I mentioned before, the Budapest Memorandum was the United States guaranteeing the security of Ukraine if it would turn over its nuclear weapons. And that right there, as far as I'm concerned, is enough reason for the United States to be even actively engaged in the conflict here. Obviously, the leadership in the United States doesn't agree with me, but that's my feeling. We said that if you gave up the nuclear weapons, we would protect you. What I see happening, because we're not holding up our end of the bargain, is that other countries that may have or think about getting nuclear weapons will be encouraged to get nuclear weapons because they see that the security structures of the world are not going to protect them. So that's a bad thing. We're against nuclear proliferation, and yet because we're not standing by our agreements with Ukraine, we're encouraging small countries. I mean, Lithuania maybe, I'm not saying they are, but I'm just saying a small country that is close to Russia might consider trying to get nuclear weapons in order to have a defense. And that's not something we want to see happen. So I am in completely agreement that memorandum right there is enough to have motivated the United States to be supporting Ukraine in its conflict.
Can this fact of uncertainty be the reason for prolonging the war in Ukraine?
Yes, I think so. I mean, really, there's a lot of us that feel that if the United States had given everything Ukraine needed at the beginning, as we essentially promised to do with the Budapest Memorandum, if they had given everything to Ukraine that they needed, I mean, there were several people that discussed in the early days before the war started, but when we knew it was going to start, putting U.S. troops into Ukraine as an exercise, and put like the 82nd Airborne Division in Ukraine, which would have certainly forestalled Putin's invasion. We didn't do that. We didn't close the skies over Ukraine, which is something that we could have done. So yes, I feel like the fact that the United States and Europe did not step forward as quickly as they should have in the early days of the invasion have caused it to drag on. And I think it's unfortunately going to drag on for quite some time yet.
How do you assess President Zelensky's new peace formula? He has been collaborating with various countries on this proposal for some time, and the first peace summit with representatives from over 160 countries invited is soon to be held. Do you think this format will be effective? And if so, could it be the beginning of the end of the war?
I do think that the current structure of international security guarantees has failed. With Russia on the Security Council and China on the Security Council, nothing ever can get done in the United Nations, period. I mean, that was shown during the Korean War, it's been shown a number of different times. So I think Europe needs to look internally at how it wants to organize to protect itself from Russian aggression. And I think they need to do that without depending on the United States, because right now the United States is not a reliable partner. And that's a sad thing to say, being an American, but that's just the way it is. And so I think it's very important that Europe look at how it can defend itself against this kind of aggression, which has been going on for years, since at least 2014, and continues to, in this full-scale war, it's even more dramatic. So I think it's very important, and I think it's very heartening that Europe is taking these steps to defend itself against aggression from without.
In our Christian circle, coming across the Christian military has been almost impossible since Soviet times. Most Christians had pacifist views at that time, which was understandable given the circumstances. It is very interesting how the choice to become a soldier happened in your life.
Well, it's interesting that you would say that, because I don't really come from a military family. My father was a Methodist preacher. He was not drafted in World War II because he was married, and also because he was a preacher. But he's told me personally that if he had been drafted for World War II, he probably would have been a conscientious objector. I have an uncle, on the other hand, for whom I was named, who served in World War II in Europe. But as I said, I don't really come from a very military family. But it was just something I was interested in from a fairly young age, and I applied for and received a military scholarship to college. After a couple of years of college, I decided I wasn't ready for college, and I enlisted in the military as an enlisted man, as a soldier. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I decided I did like being in the military, and I went back to college and got my degree. But so I guess you could say it just seemed like a calling that I felt drawn to. It wasn't, as I said, my father was not at all excited about me going in the military. He told me that on many occasions. He didn't oppose it per se, but he told me, he said, I'm surprised, and this is not something I would have wanted for you. But it was just something that I felt that I wanted to do. And once I had the experience of actually being in the military as an enlisted soldier, I really liked it, and I decided that I wanted to be a part of it.
The military profession requires certain qualities from a person, and I'm interested to hear how they correlate with biblical Christian principles and values.
Well, I think being a soldier requires a certain amount of self-discipline. I think everybody understands that discipline is a part of being in the military. You wear a uniform, you line up and stand at attention. So there's things that are externally placed on you that are rules and regulations and discipline that you require. But in order to be a good soldier, you have to have a certain amount of self-discipline that's inside. And I think that's kind of what drew me to it, is that there is a sense of camaraderie with other soldiers, particularly when you go through difficult situations with them, and you build that sense of brotherhood. In terms of Christian values, I like to think, even though sometimes it's hard to see that in what my country does, but I like to think that we're trying to do things in general to help the world and to help people and to rescue people from difficult situations. That certainly was the motivation, or part of the motivation, for going into Iraq, and was the fact that we felt like that they needed to be rescued from Saddam Hussein. Anyhow, like I said, that's an argument I don't want to get into, but Afghanistan was pure revenge. I mean, Afghanistan was an eye for an eye, and we should have gone in there and done what we did and came out, but we got entangled in trying to build them as a nation, and like so many other big countries that have tried to take over Afghanistan in the past, Great Britain and Russia, we didn't have a very good time of it. So, but in general, I have felt like a lot of what our military is sort of in business for is to try to help people, not just kill them. That sometimes becomes necessary, but to try to help people.
We have accomplished a lot as a society, but is there a way to solve modern problems without resorting to war?
And the answer to that in today's world, I would say no. It's very clear that there are bad actors out there. There are people out there that want to take what other people have without permission. I mean, Russia and Putin are a perfect example. I mean, you could stand at the border of Russia all day long and wave palm leaves and go kumbaya, and that's not going to stop Russian tanks from crashing through your people. So in order to defeat somebody like Russia and potentially China, you're going to have military forces, and you're going to have be willing to go to war. We don't have an effective international government. We don't have an effective international means of really making decisions. The United Nations is essentially a social club, and the two principal bad actors in the world, Russia and China, sit on the Security Council, so that's guaranteed that it can't do anything. So I would say no. There's not a system in place today to allow the stop of bad things without military force.
The United States of America has never had a war on its territory, but American troops have participated in many military conflicts in the territories of other countries. What is the moral basis of American troops' military missions?
Well, it's not true to say that America's never had a war on its territory. It hasn't had a war on its territory since 1865. America first sort of emerged on the world stage in World War I, and when we helped Europe defeat Kaiser Germany, and then became isolated again until the beginning of World War II. And of course, for the first few years of the war, America did not get involved militarily. They got involved with supporting, providing supplies and so forth. But I think after World War II, I think the decision was made, or the feeling was, that this was going to keep happening again and again. There was going to be a continual conflict, certainly in areas of Europe, but also in other parts of the world, unless America took an active role in helping the world, grow up a little bit. So, it's like Germany and Japan were the two principal enemies in World War II. We defeated and we occupied Germany and Japan. And now Germany and Japan are two of our strongest democratic allies in the world. And I think that's one of the things that we saw after World War II, was that trying to share those values of how a democracy works had very long-term positive effects for those two particular countries that we occupied, and we helped grow their democracy from within. So I think that, the success in World War II and the success after World War II in converting these two very hostile states into friends and democratic allies, I think is one of the reasons that America has felt like it needed to keep that place in the world.
The life of a soldier is life in constant danger. Did you see miracles during these wars?
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I don't think of miracles very much. I think my wife refers to them as God things. So things that come together because somebody was behind the scenes making things come together. I think that's what I sort of point to when I think of things where God has had his hand on something to make it come together. And you know, when we were starting to come to Kriviri, I was primarily coming to share my knowledge of explosives for safety purposes and so forth. And my wife was coming too to support me and to be involved. And then Yuli Morozov wanted to know about our backgrounds, and he wanted to see a CV from each of us. And then when he found out that my wife had 23 years of experience as a rehabilitation specialist and with the military, and then he immediately, you know, began to talk about HEART, the rehabilitation center. To me and to her, that was really a God thing. That was, you know, she was coming over here really just to support me, but she had all this background. And not only the background as a rehabilitation specialist, but a background in taking care of veterans. And then, you know, the Union of Responsible Citizens here is building a new rehab center for veterans and people affected by the war. And I just think that was, you know, whether you want to call it a miracle, I think that was just a movement that was pushed together by some hands, some unseen hands. So I think that's the example I would like to use.
In your opinion, how does the war in Ukraine differ from other wars you have participated in?
The biggest difference is that Ukraine is what we would refer to in the United States military as a high-intensity conflict. So you've got trench lines, you've got people using aircraft and tanks and all that kind of stuff. And that was never a factor really in either Iraq or Afghanistan, the parts that I was involved in. I mean, in the initial days in Iraq, yes, there was sort of like armored warfare and major operations against the Iraqi forces, but that was over really in a matter of a few weeks, and there was never really any doubt to what was happening because the United States had vastly superior aircraft and so forth, and vastly superior tanks. And the force was just overwhelming, which is what it was intended to be. And the same thing is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was more of a, not exactly a guerrilla war, but it was definitely a war of small engagements. Ukraine is not like that at all. Ukraine is more like what World War II was, and in places it's kind of like World War I was. Only World War I fought with, you know, World War II weapons. It's trench lines, it's assaults. It's crossing destroyed ground over and over and over again and trading that piece of ground back and forth with the enemy. But it's you know, extensive use of aircraft, of course, extensive use of drones, which is something we had virtually none of in Iraq and Afghanistan, except for surveillance aircraft, and extensive use of tanks to the extent that they can be used, but armored vehicles on both sides, and of course the artillery. I mean, there was never in Iraq, there was very little in the way of artillery threat. They had rockets that they used occasionally, and again, after the beginning. And in Afghanistan, there was never an artillery threat. I mean, they occasionally used rockets against us, and that was something we continued to experience for quite some time in both places. But in terms of the massive artillery that the Russians unleash on the towns that they're attacking, there's never been anything like that since World War II.
We acknowledge that the war has changed us, Ukrainians, in many ways. It has led us to discover new meanings and gain a deeper understanding of life. We are now contemplating questions that we never asked ourselves before the war. As someone who has been a soldier for the entirety of your life, what is your biggest discovery?
Yes, I'm in an area where there's potential for airstrikes and things of that nature, but for the most part, I've felt really safe here, but I think there are definitely things worth living for. But yeah, there are things worth dying for, you know, and so I think you have to come to grips with what that means for yourself. You know, that's essentially what led me here, is that I felt like there was something putting my life at risk for. And certainly in the early days of the conflict when I was here, you know, there were things that I did that were quite risky. And so those were things worth living for and things potentially worth dying for.
You and your wife are both military. How would you describe the marriage of two military people?
Well, I have to say that my wife was out of the military before I ever met her. So she had military experience, but we met, she was working as a civilian in a hospital. I do think, though, that the fact that she had military experience, she's been able to understand me a lot better than maybe somebody who wouldn't have. You know, she understands about deployment. She understands about being separated, and she understands about you know, the kinds of responsibilities of the person at home. And I understand that the person at home goes through a lot of stresses and difficulties too. And since we've been married, she's pretty much been the person at home. When I was still on active duty, when I was still in the military, and even after I left the military and went to work for the federal government, a lot of my travel, most of it, was without her. Now, we were able to be together in Iraq, and we were able to be together in Jordan, but many times I traveled elsewhere in the region or elsewhere in the world doing my work, and she had to be at home, and I was out there. So I think her having had the military experience and herself having been served in Germany during the Cold War made her able to understand and support you know, my willingness to be gone or my need to be gone much better than another woman might have.
John, how do military veterans in America spend their retirement?
Well, when you talk about military veterans, you know, a lot of people in the U.S. don't serve an entire career in the military. And of course, those military veterans go on to a second career or a third career. And even military retirees like myself often go on to a second career because, generally speaking, when you retire, you're in your 40s or maybe 50s, you know, so you still have a number of good working years left. So I would say most military veterans are working. There are some that have retired finally and are maybe sitting on a rocking chair on their porch, but for the most part, military veterans are working.
I have asked Ukrainians this question many times, but for the first time, I'm asking an American citizen. How was your February 24th of 2022?
That happened a day or two. I mean, I was very shocked when I heard it happen. I just hardly couldn't believe it. I know that Sunday I was watching videos on my phone about what was happening in Ukraine. And even in the car on the way home from church, my wife said, "You're really convicted. You have to do something." And I said, "Yes, I have to do something." So that was kind of how I spent that period of time.
You have been with your wife in Ukraine for 150 days since the beginning of the Great War, and this is your 5th visit. How did you decide to go to Ukraine during the war, and what do you do here?
So in church, we were studying the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had returned to Germany to struggle against Nazism. And I really felt like what I saw happening in Ukraine was a struggle of good against evil. And I really felt like I needed to do something. But, you know, I'm an older guy, probably wasn't suited to go in a trench line. And there's some laws, because I'm a retired officer, that prevent that anyway. But I said, somehow I can help. And I saw a social media video of some DSNS, the State Emergency Services guys. So that motivated me to come here. And my wife recognized this feeling in me about the fact that I just felt this need to do something, that we both recognized that what we saw was a real struggle of good against evil. Now, she didn't come with me on the first trip, but she joined me while I was in Kyiv. And we had an opportunity, we traveled with a photographer, a press photographer, and we had an opportunity for her to visit some of the scenes of destruction that I had already been to. And particularly in Bucha, she was given a chance to see all these civilian automobiles that had been shot up by the Russians. And the guard who was guarding this area knew all these people, and he was able to tell the stories of the individual families. And she was just overcome with emotion. So what I was doing in those days was trying to help clear the unexploded munitions at Hostomel Airport and in Irpin and Bucha and around Kyiv. And so I did that along with the National Police EOD and worked closely with them for several months there, and went back home and then came back to Ukraine to continue that work. And since then I've been primarily doing instruction to civilians and to police and military on how to be safe around explosive ordnance, or how to avoid it, or how to deal with it on a limited scale. That's what I've been doing. My wife, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is a retired occupational therapist, and she's very much involved with the establishment of this new rehabilitation center, HEART, in Kryvyi.
Often, when we serve others, we also get something important for ourselves. How was your time in Ukraine, and were there any important personal highlights for you?
I don't want to say that my life was purposeless before, but I was retired, and I was helping in my community. I did food deliveries and things like that in my community. But this is really something that's really grabbed me as something to live for, as something to work for. And I hope to keep doing it.
I know that when you return to the US, you act as an ambassador for Ukraine there. I just want to express a huge thank you on behalf of all Ukrainians for your service in Ukraine and for the effort you are making to raise awareness about Ukraine in the US. Please share with us how you inform Americans about Ukraine.
Well, one of the things that initially when we got back from the first trip, our church wanted to hear about it. And so we actually had a formal get-together at the church where we invited people from the community to come in, and we talked about our experiences in Ukraine. And that was sort of how it began. I've been interviewed on CNN. I've been interviewed by the Military Officers Association magazine and Army Times and several other organizations. And then, but local things in North Carolina, we've had an opportunity to speak there. I spoke at the Special Forces Convention in Colorado, and I spoke at the National EOD Association Convention in Oklahoma. And so I've been invited, both of us have been invited to talk about our experiences in Ukraine in several different places. Local organizations in North Carolina, and also national organizations. My wife has spoken to our congressmen personally. I've written to them, of course. And she's gone to meetings on Ukraine's behalf. She spoke at the Ukraine rally on the 24th of February in Asheville just a few days ago. We've taken many opportunities to speak about Ukraine. In some cases, we're trying to raise money for a particular project, like I raised money for women's uniforms for the National Police. But not all of these events are for raising money, and they're mainly for raising awareness, to let people know what's going on here. And so sometimes it's just an encounter on a very personal level where somebody will ask a question. Oh, you've been to Ukraine, what was that like? And so we'll have a few minutes to talk to one person or two people on what our experiences were like. So it's been big and small, big and small. Sometimes big groups, sometimes small groups, sometimes just one person.
You are a mine safety specialist. How do you see the situation with mine safety or danger in Ukraine, and what are the future prospects in this area?
We generally say for a conflict, a high-intensity conflict, 1 year of conflict is going to require 5 years of work to clear the area. I think that's probably on the low side for Ukraine because of the very high intensity level of fighting that's going on and the way the artillery is used. One of the things I talk about, when I do a briefing, I have a picture, a satellite photograph of a field in Ukraine that has all these explosive craters on it from artillery fire. And I tell people that about 20% of Russian ordnance and all kinds of ordnance throughout the world, when it's fired, about 20% of it doesn't work. because of manufacturing defects or because something went wrong in the fuse or it wasn't put in properly or whatever. So you've got, when you see a big field like that covered with craters, there's about 20% more that there's no crater for, but there's a live explosive shell in the ground. That's in addition to the mines and things that have been deliberately placed either by hand or scattered from aircraft or scattered from artillery shells or rockets. There's literally millions of those kinds of explosive devices scattered about Ukraine. And there's lots of people both in Ukraine and out of Ukraine that are working on automated methods of trying to detect that stuff using drones, using AI, using all sorts of thermal imaging, all sorts of technologies are working on that, because the previous methods have been basically to determine an area that has explosive ordnance and then basically have guys go up and probe. I mean, that's the traditional method of doing it. And that's just too slow. It's going to take, 100 years to do that. Now, having said that, there will be a lot of area cleared in 5 or 10 years after the war is over. That doesn't mean, we're finding stuff in the United States from our Civil War that was over 150 years ago. There's stuff finding in Ukraine that was from World War II and in parts of Europe from World War I. So just because we make a concerted effort to demine things doesn't mean it's all going to be found. So there's going to be a continuing hazard from unexploded ordnance and mines, which are kind of two different things, but mines were meant to go off when you stepped on them, where unexploded ordnance was meant to go off when it hit, for the most part. So, but both of them present an explosive hazard, and particularly to children, because they're curious and they want to pick things up and play with it. So I think it's going to take at least 15 to 30 years to fully clear Ukraine, and even then there will be a few things that we miss.
Please name the 3 main rules or pieces of advice on mine safety for our Ukrainians who have not undergone these trainings.
When we talk about explosive ordnance, we tell people that if it looks dangerous to you, it probably looks dangerous to us too. So in other words, don't assume that something is safe or can be picked up and moved simply because it's been there for a while. The second thing is that we say if you can see the dangerous device, it can see you. And by that we're talking about the fact that if something explodes, fragmentation travels at about 900 meters per second, much faster than a bullet, and typically goes out to a great distance. It depends on the size of the explosive object, of course. But so if you can see an explosive object and it goes off, it can see you. So that's kind of the second rule. So our third rule is really don't touch it, don't move it, and call the police.
A huge price has been paid for our freedom. We have no right to be defeated. So how can we win this war? What should we, as countries, as people, as Christians, do right now?
I think that what has to be done is that Ukraine has to do a little more of what it's already doing, which is focusing its entire will on winning this war. I think there are many people right now that are very, very supportive of the war, both in the U.S. and certainly in Europe and Ukraine. We're going to have to create more formations to fight the war. And as Christians, what we're going to have to do is continue to support each other and support the soldiers at the front and support all the workers that are doing all that they can. All the places I've been to in the community where I've done my presentations are making things for the war effort. And I think that is a big sign of what Christians do for each other, is take care of each other.